Montana Territory. Spring of 1883, the wind howled low across the flats near the Milk River, and the only color in the gray dawn was the blood smeared across the hem of her skirt. Keziah Whitlow did not cry as she walked. Her boots were soaked through, her hands scraped raw from the rocky gully she had climbed out of. She carried nothing but the weight of silence, and the small hand of her son pressed into hers. "Are we gonna find someone, Mama?" asked Peter, age 5, his voice thin with exhaustion. Her other child, 3-year-old Pearl, was asleep against her shoulder, arms limp around Keziah's neck. Keziah gave a small nod, unsure if he even looked up to see it. She had not spoken once since they left the cabin. Her mouth would not open, and there was too much inside her chest that would spill out if it did. Behind them, miles back, her husband lay on the floor of the house he built with his own fists. The house he had once promised would be a place of peace. His blood had dried into the floorboards. She had not meant to kill him, but when he raised that rifle toward Peter, something in her broke free. The trail had been nothing but cold and dust for 2 days now. Keziah did not know where she was going, only away. Away from the shouts, the bruises, the slammed doors, the way he used to say she was too quiet, like it was her fault he could not hear what she never said. By mid-morning, her legs gave out. She and the children collapsed beneath a grove of cottonwoods by the riverbank. That was where he found them. He rode up slow, his horse picking careful steps through the grass. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with a rifle strapped loose at his side and a faded tan coat that came nearly to his knees. He did not speak at first, just dismounted, stayed a few paces back. "You hurt?" he asked softly. Keziah blinked up at him. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Peter shrank behind her. "I ain't gonna touch you," the man added, crouching down to their level. "Name's Yates Langley. I got a place about 3 miles west." "You folks look like you could use rest." Peter clutched her skirt. "Mama," Yates's eyes flicked to the boy, then the baby. His gaze was steady, kind. He did not press. Keziah looked at him a long time. Then she gave one slow nod. He rode beside them as they followed the river upstream. When her knees buckled, he lifted Pearl into his arms with the gentleness of a man who had done it before. The little house stood tucked into a grove of pine, with smoke curling steady from the chimney and chickens scratching in the yard. Yates showed them in, made no comment about the dirt on their clothes or the silence that followed Keziah like a shadow. He laid Pearl in his bed without hesitation and handed Peter a piece of cornbread. Then he turned to Keziah. "You do not have to say anything. I just want you to know you are safe here." She stood there, hands trembling, and finally whispered, "Thank you." He nodded once. "Silence does not bother me." That night, Pearl stirred in her sleep and Yates went to her first, checking her forehead with the back of his hand. Keziah watched from the doorway, arms folded tight. "You have children?" she asked, voice hoarse. A shadow passed through his face. "Had a daughter, long time ago." Keziah did not ask more. She only nodded. In the days that followed, she did not speak much, but she listened. Yates talked in a quiet, easy voice about the land, the way the river changed colors at dusk, the best way to keep foxes from the chicken coop. He never asked about the bruises on her arms or the way Peter flinched at loud noises. He just made sure there was always food on the table and a warm fire burning. One evening, Keziah found herself standing beside him on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The sky was streaked in gold and orange. "You do not ask me about him," she said. Yates leaned against the railing. "You will tell me when you are ready." "I might never be," she said. He turned toward her. "That is fine." She looked at him, then really looked. He was not a handsome man, not in the way her husband had once been, but his face was steady, strong. His eyes were soft in the corners. She felt safe near him, and she could not remember the last time she had known what that felt like. Peter had taken to following Yates everywhere. In the mornings, the boy helped gather eggs. In the afternoons, he rode with him to the line fence. Keziah watched them from a distance, her heart full and aching. One night as she tucked Pearl into bed, the little girl whispered, "I like the cowboy." Keziah brushed hair from her daughter's brow. "He is good to us," Pearl nodded. "He smiles at you." Keziah turned her face away so the child would not see the tears. Later that week, Yates came home from town with a new pair of boots for Peter, a ribbon for Pearl's hair, and a wool shawl for Keziah. She held it in her hands, not knowing what to say. "Thought you might like to be warm," he said simply. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead to his chest. He did not speak. He just wrapped his arms around her and held her as the last light faded from the sky. The first rain came on a Thursday. It started as a hush against the pine needles, then deepened into a steady rhythm that quieted even the birds. Inside the cabin, Keziah sat near the hearth with Pearl curled against her side and Peter sprawled on a wool rug, drawing patterns in the ash with a stick. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. Yates came in late, clothes soaked through and hat dripping. He paused just inside the door, water running from his coat in thin lines. Keziah rose before he could speak, took his coat and hung it by the fire without a word. He watched her with something unreadable in his eyes. "Thank you." She set a tin cup on the table, steam rising from it. "There's tea. It's not hot anymore." He stepped forward, took the cup, and sat. "Don't think I've had tea since my sister passed." She used to serve it like it was a sermon, quiet with both hands. Keziah sat across from him, fingers laced in her lap. "What happened to her?" "Fever took her the winter before last. Her husband went the same week. Left me their boy, Jacob. He's with kin south of the Judith now. You raised him for a while. He didn't talk much either. Not until we started fixing the barn roof together. Then he wouldn't stop." Peter looked up from the floor. "Did he like horses?" "Didn't trust him at first," Yates said, "but he came around." "Same as I did." That night after the children were asleep, Keziah stayed behind while Yates went out to check the barn. She stood by the window, watching the dark shape of him cross the yard with a lantern in hand. When he returned, his boots left wet prints across the floor, and she handed him a towel without meeting his gaze. "Roof held fine," he said. "Might need patching before snowfall, though." She nodded, then added, "I can sew canvas if you've got some." Yates set the towel aside and leaned against the table. "You ever live on land before?" "My father farmed outside Atchison. Corn and chickens mostly." "You miss it," she considered. "No, but I remember the sound of bees in the summer. That I miss." He smiled at that, a small twitch at the corner of his mouth. "I got bees." She looked at him, lips parting slightly. "Where?" "Hollow stump east of the line fence." "Been meaning to build boxes for him. I could help." Yates held her gaze for a long moment. "I'd like that." In the weeks that followed, they worked side by side without speaking much more than needed. Peter and Pearl grew stronger, color returning to their cheeks. The children followed Yates like shadows, and he never once turned them away. One morning, Keziah found herself alone with him near the creek, where they'd gone to gather stones for a smokehouse foundation. She knelt beside the water, hands dipped in the current, while Yates sat on a flat rock, knife in hand, shaping a length of ashwood. He didn't look up when he spoke. "You plan on moving on?" She didn't answer right away. The stream whispered over the stones. "I don't know where I'd go," she said finally. "There's land here, not much, but it's enough." She turned to face him. "You offering it, I'm saying you're welcome to stay. You and the little ones, I'll not ask for anything." Keziah stood slowly, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I never wanted land. I wanted quiet, peace. I think maybe you've earned that." The words settled between them like dust on sun-warmed wood. She looked down at him, this man who never asked more than she could give, who spoke as if grief was a thing that didn't need taming. "That day you found us," she said, voice low, "I thought we'd die out there." "I didn't," he said. "I saw a woman still standing." She stepped closer, close enough to see the faint scar at his temple, the way his eyes didn't flinch from hers. "I still don't sleep through the night." "Neither do I." Pearl's voice carried faintly from the house. Keziah turned her head, listening. Yates stood, brushing off his trousers. "We should get back." They walked side by side across the field, not touching, not speaking. But there was something different in the air between them, something settled and warm, like embers that hadn't gone out after all. The wind shifted in June. It carried the scent of wild sage and warm soil, and the nights grew soft enough for the windows to stay open. On the ridge behind the cabin, the pines whispered in the dark, and the stars brightened without the frost in the air to dim them. Keziah had begun to hum while she worked. Not songs, just tuneless threads of sound that came when her hands were busy, and her thoughts were somewhere far off, but not unpleasant. One morning, while rinsing clothes in the creek, she caught herself doing it and stopped. But then Peter called out from up the bank, and she smiled without thinking. The sound came again. That evening, as she shelled peas by the firelight, Yates sat near the hearth mending a saddle cinch. His fingers moved slow and sure through the thick leather. "Pearl said you used to read to her," he said after a while, keeping his eyes on the stitching. "You still got any books?" Keziah glanced up. "I left them behind, only took what we could carry. I've a box in the loft, mostly old almanacs and a copy of Robinson Crusoe. Might be worth dusting off. Pearl likes stories with animals that talk." Yates gave a quiet nod. "I'll see what I can find." She reached into the basket for another pod. "Did you read to your daughter?" "Most nights. She liked the parts I changed when I got tired. Didn't care if they made sense long as my voice kept going." Keziah didn't answer at once. The fire cracked and hissed, and Peter's laughter echoed faintly from outside, where he played with a carved horse Yates had whittled last week. "She would have liked that," she said. Yates looked up. "Who? My mother. She taught me to read before I ever held a needle, said it would be a kind of freedom. Was she right, in some ways?" They didn't speak again that night, but when Keziah rose to bank the fire, she paused by his chair. He looked up, waiting. She didn't say anything, just reached out and touched the back of his hand with her fingers, light as breath. Then she turned and went to her children. The next morning, she found the book on the table. It was worn through the spine and smelled faintly of dust, but tucked inside was a folded note in careful handwriting. For Pearl, and whoever else might need it. She traced the letters with her thumb but didn't unfold it. Instead, she placed it on the shelf near the hearth and left it there like a promise. By midsummer, the smokehouse was nearly done. Keziah had helped with the stonework, her palms calloused from the work but steady. Yates taught Peter to set traps for rabbits, and Pearl had taken to following the hens around with a stick, pretending to be their schoolteacher. One afternoon, as they worked near the beehives, Keziah stood watching Yates lift a frame from the box, bees humming all around them. She wore a veil he'd stitched from muslin and wire. Her hands stayed still, her breath even. "You're not afraid," he said, glancing at her. "I've lived through worse." He smiled then, the lines at the corners of his mouth deepening. "That's not what I meant." She tilted her head. "What did you mean? You're not afraid to stay?" The words caught something inside her. She looked down at the ground between them, the dry grass, the bees moving in and out of the hive like they'd always belonged there. "I don't know what staying means yet," she said. "It doesn't have to mean anything more than today." She met his eyes then. "And tomorrow?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That night, with the children asleep and the cabin quiet but for the fire and the wind outside, Keziah stepped out onto the porch. Yates was already there, leaning against the post, coat unbuttoned, sleeves rolled to the elbows. In the starlight, his face looked younger, the edges of grief softened by time and something gentler. She stepped beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his arm without touching. "I used to think silence was a punishment," she said. He turned toward her. "And now it feels like a place I can rest." He reached up slow as dusk and brushed her hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered, calloused and warm. "I don't need words from you," he said. "But I'll take them when you're ready." She leaned into him then, her cheek against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, she did not brace herself for what might come next. They stood like that until the coals burned low, and the night folded around them like a worn quilt pulled close. The wheatgrass had begun to yellow under the July sun, and each afternoon brought a haze that blurred the horizon. Mornings were still cool, though, and on one of them, Keziah woke early to the sound of Pearl's quiet breathing beside her and the hush of wind through the open window. She stepped outside wrapped in her shawl, the air damp with dew. Yates was already near the corral, leading the bay mare in slow circles. He didn't wave, just nodded once, and she crossed the yard to stand beside the fence. "She's favoring that front leg," Keziah said after watching a while. "Stone bruise, I think. I'll soak her foot later." Keziah rested her arms on the top rail. "She trusts you. She's earned that right, same as anyone." They stood in silence, the kind that carried weight but not burden. Then Yates glanced at her. "You ever ride?" "My father taught me side saddle, but I preferred bareback down by the river where no one could see." "I'd like to see that someday." She looked at him, but he didn't meet her eyes. He was watching the mare, his hand moving slowly down her neck. Later that day, he brought out the smaller saddle he'd used for Jacob. Peter watched closely as Yates adjusted the stirrups and reins, then helped him ease up into the seat. The boy's grin was shy but wide, and Keziah felt something tighten in her throat. When Peter circled the yard, wobbling but upright, she turned and walked to the edge of the field, where the wind could take the tears if they came. That evening, Keziah found Yates oiling tack by lantern light. She leaned against the post and waited until he looked up. "I want to ride again." He didn't respond right away, just rubbed a bit of oil into the leather strap and said, "Tomorrow morning." "Before the sun gets too high," she nodded. At dawn, she tied her hair back in a knot and stepped into the grass barefoot, boots in one hand. Yates stood by the mare, saddle already cinched, reins loose in one hand. He held a hand out without speaking. She took it. He helped her up, then stepped back, watching as she gathered the reins. Her back was straight, and though her hands trembled, her eyes were steady. She rode the edge of the pasture, the mare moving slow and sure, and when she returned, Yates was still there. "I'd forgotten how it felt," she said. "You looked like you hadn't." That night, while the children slept, Keziah sorted through the spare trunk in the loft. Among the tools and seed packets, she found an old oil lamp and a set of folded letters tied with ribbon. She didn't open them. Instead, she brought the lamp down and cleaned it, filled it, and lit it to place on the table. When Yates came in from the barn, he paused in the doorway, looking at the soft glow it cast across the walls. "I thought it might be nice," she said, smoothing a wrinkle from her apron. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "It is." They sat at the table, neither speaking for a while. Then she looked at him fully, her hands still in her lap. "You've been patient. I'm not in a hurry, but I think I'm ready now." Yates didn't move, just watched her like he was waiting for the rest. "I don't want to leave. The children are different here. I am too. And it's not just the quiet anymore." His jaw shifted and his eyes softened. "I don't want you here just because you're grateful." Keziah stood, stepped around the table, and knelt beside his chair. She took his hand, warm and calloused in both of hers. "I want to be here because it feels like something new, not a running from, a running to." He brought one hand to her face, his thumb against her cheekbone. "You're not too quiet for me. I know." She leaned into him then, and when their lips met, it was not desperate or hurried. It was slow, like water shaping stone. The lamp flickered, and outside the pines whispered through the dark. The days stretched longer as August came on, the sun hanging high well past supper, and the fields humming with heat and crickets. Keziah had taken to tending the small garden beside the cabin, coaxing squash and beans from the soil, her hands steady and sure with the work. Pearl sat nearby most mornings, threading twigs and grasses into tiny crowns, while Peter helped Yates replace a broken gatepost down by the south fence. One evening, Yates returned from the hills with a canvas sack slung over one shoulder. He set it on the table with a quiet grunt and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Keziah wiped her hands on a cloth and stepped closer. "What's that?" Yates untied the wrapping, revealing a box of iron nails, a small hand plane, and a folded slip of paper. "Traded with a Cree family up near the Bear's Paw. They'd salvaged some tools from a mining camp. Thought these might be useful." Keziah picked up the plane, turning it in her palm. "It's good steel. They had more. Said they'd be down this way again before the snow." She set the tool aside. "I've never traded like that." Yates sat, stretching his legs. "You get to know the families, it becomes less about the goods, more about the trust." She looked at him a long moment. "You trust them?" "I do." Keziah sat across from him, her voice quieter. "I'd like to meet them next time." Yates's eyes warmed, but he only nodded. "We'll go together." That summer turned dry, the wind carrying dust from the far flats, and the garden wilted in patches. But the well held, and the hens still laid regular. On a Sunday morning, Keziah walked the ridge line with Pearl tied to her hip and a basket swinging in her hand. She gathered wild currants and watched the sky for hawks. When she returned, Yates was at the workbench outside, shaping boards with the new plane. He paused when he saw her. "I was thinking," she said, setting the basket down, "we could build shelves for the east wall for the children's things. And maybe a place for books." He wiped his brow with the edge of his sleeve. "You've got plans." "I do." Later, they built the shelves together. Peter handed them nails. Pearl watched from the doorway, and Keziah's laughter surprised even herself when Yates dropped a board on his foot and cursed under his breath. That night, after the children had been tucked in and the lamp dimmed low, Keziah found Yates sitting on the porch, whittling a narrow stick into a smooth curve. "You're always working on something," she said, stepping beside him. "Hands don't know how to sit still." She sat, close enough for their knees to touch. "Were you always like that?" He looked out over the darkened field. "After the war, I wandered east a while, worked with a fencer crew in Kansas, then drove cattle up the trail. I didn't stop moving until Jacob's mother died. Then I had to." Keziah rested her chin in her hand. "Did you love her?" Yates was quiet for a while. "Not the way I should have. We were two people trying to outrun different ghosts. It didn't last. And now," he turned to her, the knife still in his hand, the wood forgotten. "Now I'm not running." Keziah reached for his hand, took it gently in hers. "Neither am I." He leaned closer, his voice low. "You sure you want to stay?" "I'm sure." He kissed her then, slow and certain, and there was nothing left in her that doubted the shape of her life from this point on. They were married on a steady morning in late September, with the last of the asters blooming in the meadow and the sky high and blue. A preacher from down near Fort Benton came up by wagon, and neighbors from 2 valleys over arrived with pies and jars of pickled beets. Peter wore a shirt too big. his hair combed flat, and Pearl carried a bundle of dried wildflowers in both hands. Yates stood tall in a clean coat with his boots polished, his eyes fixed only on Keziah. She wore a dress of soft gray wool that she'd sewn herself, a ribbon from Pearl's hair tucked into the bodice. Her hands didn't tremble when she took his. After the vows, they ate under the trees while children played among the stumps, and someone brought out a fiddle. Keziah danced once with Peter before Yates took her hand, and they moved slow through the grass, her head resting against his shoulder. That night, with the guests gone and the house quiet again, Yates carried her across the threshold, though she laughed and told him he didn't have to. "Maybe not," he said, setting her down gently. "But I wanted to." She touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I never knew I could feel this full." He pressed his brow to hers, his voice barely a breath. "You were always meant to." In the years that followed, the shelves filled with books and drawings and the small treasures children gather. The garden grew better each spring, and Yates taught Peter to split rails while Keziah taught Pearl her letters on a slate board by the fire. Sometimes they rode beyond the ridge together, just the two of them, the land stretching wide and quiet around them. And every night, as the lamps dimmed and the wind curled soft at the windows, Keziah curled against Yates beneath the quilt she'd stitched from old shirts and found cloth, his arm around her waist, his breath steady against her neck. They did not speak of the past often, but it lived gently between them, softened by time and the daily work of love. And when Keziah looked out over their land, her children safe, her hands full with the life they'd built, she knew peace not as an idea but as a truth. She had found her home, and in Yates, her heart's rest. They grew old side by side, and nothing in the world ever felt more certain.